keeper. He holds degrees in geology and history and a Master of Public Administration with a focus on nonprofit management and environmental policy. A native of Wilmington, Kemp has served both in the U.S. Navy and the Peace Corps. Mr. Burdett will speak for a variety of organizations, but he's joined on stage by representatives of those organizations. So joining Mr. Burdett is Dana Sargent of Cape Fear River Watch, Aaron Carey of the North Carolina chapter of the Sierra Club, Jeff Gisler with the Southern Environmental Law Center, Carrie Allen of North Carolina Coastal Federation, and Brian Powell of the North Carolina Conservation Network. Thank you all for being here, and I'll turn it to Mr. Burdett.
Thank you. I am Kemp Burdett. I work down with Cape Fear River Watch, which is a 501c3 kind of grassroots environmental nonprofit down in Wilmington. I want to start by thanking the EPA as well. Thanks to the Regional Office of Research and Development for the support they've given the state, the technical support in particular, and also for the opportunity for the community to be part of this forum and to learn and to be heard on issues of how PFAS contamination affects our health and our environment. I am going to be doing a lot of the talking, but I am just one of many groups in North Carolina that has been working on the issue of PFAS contamination. Also represented here is the North Carolina Conservation Network, the North Carolina Sierra Club, the North Carolina Coastal Federation, Environment North Carolina, the Hall River Assembly, and the Southern Environmental Law Center. So kind of speaking on behalf of some of those groups, and also speaking on behalf of hundreds of thousands of North Carolinians that are members of these groups and that care very deeply about this issue in the environment. So the Cape Fear River is kind of, in many ways the epicenter of the PFAS issue in North Carolina. The Cape Fear is the largest river in North Carolina. It provides drinking water for about 1 in 5 North Carolinians. It's one of the most biologically diverse rivers in the state. And towards the end forms a large estuary before emptying out into the Atlantic Ocean. This was the headline that residents of the Lower Cape Fear woke up to a little over a year ago. And it was quite a shock, as you might imagine. And our journey since that time to now has been sometimes terrifying and sometimes infuriating and always eye-opening. But we're here now, and we are certainly very interested in seeing some strong action taken on this issue. Just a real brief history. At least as far back as 1980, we know that DuPont was releasing PFAS compounds, including GenX and others, into the Cape Fear River, the drinking water supply for many of us in southeastern North Carolina. Around 2000, DuPont began the production of Teflon using C8, which was the precursor for GenX, the compound that kind of broke this story. GenX then replaced C8 in the manufacturing process. In 2009, a consent order that came about due to one of the largest environmental lawsuits in U.S. history in Parkersburg, West Virginia, required that the company recapture 99% of the GenX it produced, but the company continued to discharge GenX and other PFAS compounds as byproducts to that manufacturing process. I kind of labeled this discovery, our discovery of the compound. It wasn't actually a discovery, though, of course, because DuPont and Chemours, of course, knew about the compounds they produced and knew what they were discharging into waterways. But the discovery by the scientific community, I'll say, happened around 2012 when scientists with the US EPA published a paper. That was followed up by a separate paper, Sun et al., including Deborah Knappy, and confirmed the presence of GenX and 6 other PFAS compounds in the Cape Fear River. And that was the basis of the story that broke in 2017, which kind of alerted our entire community about what ended up being almost 40 years of ongoing contamination of the drinking water supply for close to 300,000 people. As of July 2018, DEQ is analyzing over 25 PFAS compounds found in our water. The impacts of this are widespread. Surface water discharge contaminated our drinking water supply for a great number of people. Airborne pollutants are further impacting groundwater, surface water, agriculture, fish and shellfish, and even honey in southeastern North Carolina. Well testing to date shows 763 private wells are contaminated, and rainwater collected by scientists at UNCW over 70 miles away shows the presence of GenX and other perfluorinated compounds there. Kind of a theme throughout this has been corporate misconduct. DuPont and later Chemours have a long history of mismanagement of perfluorinated compounds and how they disclose the impacts of those compounds to communities, how they manage their discharge of those compounds. There's been long-term inaccurate reporting of air and water discharge. Some of that was touched on today. Failure to report spills, upsets, accidents, and other opportunities for these compounds to get into the environment. An unwillingness to acknowledge impacted communities or meet with communities. We have had a very difficult time and have been unsuccessful in having representatives from the company come down to Wilmington and address citizens, even though we have asked time after time. And continued corporate interference in state and federal policy making. Our community, has not been just a passive participant in this story. We've educated ourselves. We've done that in dozens of community forums. We've invited local scientists, environmental advocates, utility representatives, representatives from DEQ and DHHS, and a wide range of public health experts to help us understand this issue. We've received intensive media coverage, extraordinary local media coverage, and even state and national media coverage of this issue. And the issue has garnered considerable interest by local, state, and even some national elected officials. That education has turned into action. We've formed a number of community groups in the Wilmington and Fayetteville areas. We've filed a number of lawsuits, both private citizen lawsuits and other lawsuits. We've gone to Raleigh to encourage legislators to support our regulatory agencies, to fund those agencies in a way that they're able to do their job. And we've had numerous community meetings and rallies, published hundreds of stories in local and national media. And a number of our community members are participating in a human health exposure study for GenX and other perfluorinated compounds, which is underway now. So that's kind of the history. I'm going to touch on what we're asking the EPA to do, what we're asking from the EPA. First, provide interim support to the states, including North Carolina. Require industry accountability. Prevent PFAS use in military and civilian firefighting foam and gear. And apply the precautionary principle, and I'll go through these in a little bit more detail. We'd ask that the EPA consider all compounds in the PFAS family as a class when determining regulatory action. We would ask that the EPA provide states with standardized PFAS test methods for surface and wastewater. And we'd ask that the EPA lower the standard detection level to 10 parts per trillion in accordance with the health protective levels recommended by the Agency for Toxic Substance and Disease Registry in the EPA. Further, fully disclose the extent of the PFAS problem to the public and state regulatory bodies, including sources of known or potential PFAS contamination, including wastewater treatment sludge, potential health effects of PFAS contamination, PFAS prevalence in the environment, industrial processes that may create PFAS as a byproduct, conduct a national PFAS health study, ban any new PFAS manufacturing request, add PFAS to the list of add PFAS chemicals to the toxics release inventory, list PFAS as a hazardous substance under the Clean Water Act, and make TSCA conditions, Toxic Substance Control Act conditions on manufacturing of a PFAS applicable to its byproducts as well. The second point, demand industry accountability. What we've seen it here today as well. Voluntary compliance is not a realistic or effective expectation for industry. We ask that the EPA require full disclosure of any and all PFAS discharges into the environment, and require full disclosure of all animal and human toxicological studies conducted or contracted by the industry. And finally, eliminate the ability of industry to substitute one PFAS for another in its production. Finally, the polluter should pay when the polluter ruins our environment or threatens our health. Industry must be held financially responsible for environmental contamination, including remediation on and off-site, effective filtration systems at the individual or the utility scale when drinking water is impacted, human health studies, environmental sampling, and ongoing monitoring. Third point, protecting firefighters and families, all the use of all PFAS and aqueous film-forming foam, and firefighting gear for military and civilian use. Adopt the safe, effective alternatives used abroad. Remediate contaminated practice facilities where PFAS contamination threatens communities. And eliminate industry influence in the selection of firefighting materials. And then finally, this probably could have just wrapped up the entire presentation I just made, but we encourage the EPA to implement the internationally recognized precautionary principle, and I'm going to read it because this summary by the Wingspread Conference is as good as any. When an activity raises threats of harm to human health and the environment, precautionary measures should be taken, even if some cause and effect relationships are not fully established scientifically. In this context, the proponent of an activity, rather than the public, should bear the burden of proof. I'll just leave you with a few pictures from various rallies and events we've held. And I'm going to quickly turn it over to Jeff Gisler, Senior Attorney with the Southern Environmental Law Center, to talk about a couple of policy-related issues.
Thanks, Kim. And thank you, EPA, for coming and listening to this community. And I just wanted to mention one part of the discussion that hasn't really come up today because it's an important part, and that is what EPA is doing on the regulatory side. Because the folks at EPA are doing great work at evaluating these chemicals, looking at what happens once they're in the environment, how to clean them up. Folks at the state are working hard to do that as well, and we appreciate those efforts. But I think what has been left out is part of what Mr. Vandermeer laid out and what his recommendations for what needs to be done. That was stricter source control, improved NPDES permitting, and stronger PFAS regulations. EPA is currently undertaking 3 regulatory proceedings to make that harder. It was just announced today in a newspaper article that in the next 60 days, EPA is planning to propose a new rule that will significantly restrict which waters are protected under the Clean Water Act. That will make holding companies accountable more difficult. EPA has announced earlier this spring and took comments on a plan to reverse a decades-long position that not only can companies prohibited under the Clean Water Act from directly putting a pipe into a river like the Cape Fear River, they also cannot contaminate the groundwater, as Kim Moores has done here, and let that groundwater then contaminate the Cape Fear River. It's been a long-held position by EPA that that's prohibited under the Clean Water Act. Earlier this year, they opened a comment period announcing that they were reconsidering that position. That, if EPA reverses that long-standing position, that will make it significantly harder to hold companies like Kim Moores accountable. The last thing that I want to mention is that EPA has proposed a new approach to what scientific studies they will use as they develop regulations. And the limitations that EPA has proposed on which studies they will use could cut out some of these health studies in particular, the ones that we are talking about today that a lot of energy and a lot of effort is going into. This new proposal, if carried out, could mean that those studies then cannot be used to implement regulations. And so it's not only important to look at what happens once these chemicals get out, but also to do our best to make sure that they don't get out, that they are controlled at the source, where you can look at a single facility instead of having to look at 1,000 private wells and to sample rainwater 70 miles away. That is where the control of these pollution can be most effectively done, and EPA is currently actively working to undo those restrictions.
Our next and final panelist is Emily Donovan. Ms. Donovan is the founding member of Clean Cape Fear, an advocacy organization focused on protecting the Cape Fear River as a drinking water source. Ms. Donovan has a background in marketing communications, and she lives in Brunswick County with her family.
Good afternoon, thank you. I just want to thank the EPA for including our voice in this panel discussion. Clean Cape Fear is 100% grassroots. We are concerned citizens that have been taking action since we learned about the Comores contamination back in June 2017. Our focus has been building public awareness, pushing for stronger regulations that surround the use of PFAS. As you can see, we've done a lot this past year by attending state level science advisory boards, lobbying and making relationships with our elected officials at the state level, touring the EPA Regional Triangle Lab to learn more about what actually is in our water, and showing up at as many events and hosting as many events as the community is interested in. We are also parents, which means we've been raising our children on this water. We also live 80 to 100 miles away from the source. I think that's something that's important to remember, is just how widespread Comores' contamination has been. Like you've heard already today, this is a deja vu moment for us. Last year, it was a new state with a new name, but it was still the same problem. It was DuPont and PFOA in Parkersburg, West Virginia, 15 years ago. And it's the DuPont spinoff, Comores, and it's a C8 replacement, GenX, in Wilmington and Fayetteville, starting last year. It took 8 days for Comores to actually meet with federal, state, and local leaders behind closed doors, and protests erupted all over Wilmington, North Carolina. It was still the same players, though, and still the same problem. We learned that a couple of the members on Comores' team that showed up at that closed-door meeting were also some of the very same people that gave regular depositions for DuPont during their litigation with Parkersburg, West Virginia, that had national media coverage. Imagine how we feel completely behind the curve by a company that has been down this road many times. We started hosting Water Wednesday public forums with other community groups. We focused on what was in our water, because the one thing that's a little unique about our situation versus what the other regional summits have presented is that we're dealing with emerging contaminants. The PFAS that we're dealing with have no regulations, have no names, no standards. These aren't the existing legacy chemicals. So finding answers has been incredibly difficult for the residents in this area. We also looked at making sure that diverse communities were getting access to the same information that affluent communities were getting access to. We're also looking at the science behind it. What is the leading science saying on this topic right now? And the short answer was, nobody knows. We also began focusing on public schools. Brunswick, New Hanover, and Pender County service 47,000 students in their public schools, And our biggest concern was these kids were not gonna have access to clean water when school started that last year. October of last year, we took some water samples from a Brunswick County elementary school, and this was 4 months after learning about the GenX contamination. We found 19 different PFAS in the water. I don't know why this keeps going ahead of me. Total mixture was 167 parts per trillion that day. 16 of those PFAS have 0 health advisories. We're drinking mystery chemicals, and it's a mystery cocktail that we're feeding our children. We also learned through the Sun et al. Study that the average concentration was 631 parts per trillion of GenX, and that's just GenX, which was only 12% of what you learned earlier today that CFPUA was finding in their samples. We also were extremely concerned that the one thing that the body of science has been showing is that these are endocrine disrupting chemicals, that they do bioaccumulate, and that they live forever in our environment. Where we have landed as a community is that a lack of information does not necessarily equal safe to drink in our minds. When you can't answer simple questions like what is the margin of exposure for chronic consumption of PFAS? Margin of exposure being if we've been chronically consuming, on average, 631 parts per trillion of just one chemical, well then what's our margin exposure moving forward for that same chemical? Is it really 140 parts per trillion? Can science really answer that right now? What is the acceptable dose of the various PFAS toxic mixture that's in our water? Again, those 19 different PFAS in our water that has 0 scientific information about it. How safe and at what dose is it safe at? Since we've been chronically exposed to it for 40 years, at some peak levels in the Sun et al. Study, it was 4,500 parts per trillion, again, of just GenX, which was only a small portion of the PFAS that was discovered in our water. I think it's also important for everyone to realize that we're real people and we have real stories. We're not just widgets. We're not just numbers. We are people. We've worked with a film crew that has been documenting the GenX story, and we've partnered with Cape Fear River Watch to show this video, and I'm not quite sure if it's going to pop up on its own or.
Here it comes.
23 years in special forces, and an enemy could not kill my water main.
Here we have what appears to be an environmental crime that happened to us, so we're the victims of it.
In this era of not knowing who to trust in the news industry, this is a very hard story to follow.
And we don't drink any, you can't drink it. They suggest that you can wash your dishes in it. And you just can't drink it, get it inside you.
The chemical, like I said, is getting, that's how it's getting into everybody's wells.
Half 30 customers, one size females. Every single one of them has fatty liver.
She has about 10 on the other side.
And Zeus we had to put down because they turn cancerous.
You have to know how to document the evidence you have.
I don't think there's a majority of people that say they want to let corporations pollute our waterways, but they don't understand all the background that goes into that.
You have to know what the laws are. You have to know what standards are.
I am below DEQ levels, but since my neighbors are highly contaminated, I cannot sell my home. Are y'all gonna buy my house? Are y'all gonna help me sell my home? What am I supposed to do?
Corporations want to make money, and they don't want to have regulations hamper that.
Based on their history, you're never quite sure what you can and cannot believe.
For 30 or 40 years, you just didn't tell us what was happening. And now to come back and say, oh, we're going to clean it all up, I'll bet you there's not 2% of these people out there now that believe that.
You have to know what contaminants you're looking for.
There's a lot more out there than GenX.
Per polychlorinated alkyl substances.
The PFAS issue is national, I mean, it's international.
Hey, I mean, I didn't know it was gonna be, for years, and it's probably gonna end up being years. That's before we can get anything done.
And these were the voices of the local groundwater contamination, but we also have voices too. We've been noticing that there's the municipal water contamination to the south in Brunswick, Pender, and Hanover County, and then we have the local residents here in Fayetteville that have been dealing with the same contamination. This is Abigail. She was 4 years old when she found out that she had a bilateral Wilms tumor. And I'll let you read her bio. This is Nathan. He was 4 years old when he was diagnosed with the same obscure tumor. This is Carter, and he was 9 months old when he was diagnosed with a type of kidney cancer. He lived to be 13 months old. This is Maddie, and she was 5 years old when she was diagnosed with cancer. She passed away 1 month shy of her 9th birthday. This is Jacob, and he was 8 years old when he was diagnosed with leukemia and endured 1,180 straight days of chemo. Dr. Jamie DeWitt from East Carolina says that cancer takes time to reveal itself in humans, but I would like to say that we have some canaries in the coal mine, per se, for our PFAS contaminations that are already presenting some cancers. This was a statement that was made in a Star News report saying that there was no significant cancer spikes in our region. But we'll also see that North Carolina, and well, in our specific region of Brunswick, Pender, and New Hanover County, we have an incredibly high rate of thyroid cancer. We also have a high rate of testicular cancer. And scientists at UNCW, toxicologists, say that this merits more study. Testicular, thyroid, and childhood cancers are already on the rise in Wilmington, and we are requesting that a nationwide PFAS human exposure study be implemented. I know that was discussed earlier today. My big concern is, are we focusing just on the legacy PFAS, or will we be including the emerging contaminants? Banning 1 or 2 PFAS, like PFOA and PFAS, which is what was phased out, is not good enough for us. We need PFAS to be regulated as an entire class of highly toxic chemicals. If we look at this timeline right here, like everyone knows, DuPont opened up a facility here in Fayetteville in 1980, and then they changed names to Chemours when they spun off in 2015. The year that Parkersburg, West Virginia decided to start suing them for C8 was roughly the same time that DuPont then stopped making C8 at their facility in Parkersburg, West Virginia, and relocated it to Fayetteville, North Carolina, and began producing it there, which they produced until it phased out and was replaced with the GenX that they began producing. However, the GenX that we find in our river is that byproduct GenX from the vinyl ether processing. And if you also see down there, you can see where EPA started saying that PFOA was a likely human carcinogen. You look at the difference between when this lawsuit started and when the EPA was able to use sound science to actually say that maybe this was not good for our water. You see that there was a big lag of a couple of years, 4 years maybe. If we're going to continue to do that with every chemical in the PFAS family, if we're going to use sound science to wait out, then we're going to have a 4-year lag over those 1,200 different PFAS that we know about, and that's not okay for us. PFAS makers must provide standards for all the PFAS that they make, including their byproducts. If you look down here, you'll see naphthalene byproduct 2, you'll see a couple of other chemicals. These chemicals were discovered in August of last year, about 40 days after learning about GenX. The EPA found these chemicals. If you see the red line on those graphs, that's the 140 parts per trillion safety goal that North Carolina has for GenX. And then if you look at the yellow lines, those are all way above. That was what was still in our water after we learned and after we asked Chemours to stop putting it in the water. So the tap water is still deemed safe to drink this whole time with those chemicals in it, but it's not based on sound science. It's actually based on a lack of information. We want rodent toxicology on all known PFAS. So if the EPA starts requiring that companies like Chemours and other manufacturers of PFAS provide standards for every chemical that they make and the byproducts, then the EPA can start working on providing rodent toxicology for some of those. Currently, the EPA only offers health advisories for PFOA and PFOS. However, what we found out, and I think our area is an incredible example of scientists not even, these chemicals being so new that scientists can't even name them, that we can't even access test standards that can accurately weigh and quantify them. We can't even begin to address the toxicological health effects of them using basic animal studies. And we can't confidently declare the water safe to drink for all populations if we can't even answer certain basic questions about what's in our water. We're also requesting mandatory comprehensive PFAS testing. Test for more than just GenX. When we learned about groundwater contamination, Clean Cape Fear sent out mailers, little postcards to all the residents that lived around the Chemours facility, and we told them to make sure that they asked DEQ to test for the full EPA 537 method, plus a couple of the new emerging compounds that were coming online. We are also asking that every federal agency work together to deny federal contracts to chronic PFAS polluters. We're not anti-industry. What we're anti is chronic pollution, which is what this one particular company is. And this one particular company should not be getting taxpayer dollars on federal contracts if they can't clean up their own mess. This is a simple story of greed. This company right here, DuPont Chemours, absolutely can afford to clean up their waste stream. The technology exists. They're choosing not to do it. They make some products that we know are essential to the way that we live in this modern society. It will be incredibly difficult to ban those products, but what we can request is that they should not be given opportunities to succeed and grow and praised for doing irresponsible, greedy things. We're also asking that PFAS polluters must pay for the cleanup. We've found that there's GenX in the honey and there's GenX in the fish. Widespread air and water pollution from DuPont Chemours means that chronic exposure to toxic PFAS is harmful for us. PFAS live forever, they're infecting everything, and polluters should pay, not us. When you heard from CFPUA, ratepayers are having to pay for the cleanup. I live in Brunswick County. We're looking at having to pay for the cleanup. We should not be paying for a corporation's problem because this is our river, it's our land, it's our air, not theirs. We're also asking, in line with the National PFAS Coalition, which is a ton of organizations like myself all across the country, for a maximum contaminant level of 1 part per trillion. 250,000 people live here in this area of North Carolina. And our drinking water, soil, rain, and food supply is contaminated with these PFAS chemicals, and this is just from one company. Make public health more important than political industry pressures. Again, it's disheartening to see that the EPA has spent more time, and we know that there are career EPA that are working so hard for this. There's also political appointee EPA members, and we are just begging those members to listen very carefully to the community and to the people and the real stories, and to help focus on making sure that our water, our air, our land, and our basic human rights are being protected above that of corporate greed. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you, Emily. today. That concludes our working session for the morning and early afternoon. Before we leave, we do have lunch available. Thank you all for hanging in there. There is a lunch buffet that is available for purchase. There's brisket, baked beans, green beans, and rolls. Here at the facility, there are also food